and see something. One topic that was kind of popped into my eye from this list was the topic of lying. And so, because there is this idea that lying is actually a very bad thing, that it kind of goes against the nature of speech. And I think you mentioned this idea once in a conversation, that it's kind of like you are using a faculty for the opposite of its natural purpose or aim. But when you read the book of Richard Dawkins about evolution, he says that lying has always been an important part of evolution, like as a strategy, because the genes are not necessarily ethical in their behavior. They just do whatever they can to increase their own success in the world. And so there are various examples of animals, for example, pretending to be something that they are not, because that has an advantage for them. And lying with words is just kind of the same thing in human terms. So we could compare these two ideas if you feel that would be interesting.
Well, of course, I wouldn't agree with Mr. Dawkins or Dr. Dawkins' premises about evolution, because I don't believe in a theory. But one thing that is relevant to understanding these issues, it would seem to be the case, or it is the case, I would certainly say, that morality and whether lying is good or bad is not about consequences, strictly speaking. And I think this is one of the problems, that many think about the permissibility or lack thereof when it comes to lying in terms of what kind of consequences does it produce. And let's think about hypothetical scenarios where lying might be beneficial or produce these and that consequences. And then perhaps, as I interpret it, Dr. Dawkins tried to say the same thing about the consequences lying has had for the evolutionary development of certain species. But I would reject that notion of viewing ethics as something that is about what kind of consequences does it produce and get out there. That's not what morality is about, and that's not the correct approach for me. What I would say is that you need to have an approach based upon what is good for human beings and what is going to fulfill our natures, because we all have a nature and we all have a teleological end, that is something to which we are by nature striving towards fulfilling, some function inherent in our nature. And the purpose of morality is those normative truths by which we are supposed to, or in which we are supposed to reach that end. So it's not about consequences as sort of a quantity put out there, but rather fulfilling an essence or nature. So I think that would be a very foundational principle behind all these issues.
Yes, interesting way to start this comparison of these two ideas. I was just thinking, I want to ask you a second kind of follow-up question, because I kind of think that morality or ethics has to do with consequences, but it's not the short-term direct consequences, but it's the long-term general consequences for, let's say, the entire society. And so that ethics has to do with prohibiting or stopping behavior which might be attractive to an individual in the short term, but not good for the general society in the long term. And I guess if you say that human beings have a nature and that this nature is social, that when you behave correctly according to the nature of a human being, then in the long term it will actually have good consequences. So, yeah, what do you think about that?
Well, I would agree that when human beings fulfill the nature and strive towards virtue, that will produce good long-term consequences. And actually, in a way, I would say it produces even short-term consequences, but perhaps not in the way people think. Because many people, when they think about consequences, would perhaps think of certain kind of material or bodily benefits. But I think more of benefits to the soul. What will bring you happiness in the soul? And this would sort of touch upon what we have been discussing with Hassan in an earlier conversation. So I would then, yes, agree that long-term consequences, that would certainly be something that happens. And if a society lives according to its natural purpose and fulfills what human beings are striving towards, then that will be a great society with great consequences, both material and spiritual. But still, I would see that more as a side effect, a good side effect of the principle that someone is fulfilling the nature, and that is what morality is about, um, rather than consequences itself being sort of the standard or the focus. It's rather about us fulfilling nature. And also another related point would be when we talk about consequences, there's also the question of, well, how do we determine whether these consequences are good or bad? Some might say, well, this is bad because it leads to this consequence of these amount of bodily harms or inconvenience, etc. But one can ask the question, well, why are such things bad? Why are these kinds of harms and these kinds of inconveniences bad? And I would say that in order to make that intelligible philosophically, we would say that something is good or bad. It goes back to the principle that is it contributable to human nature being fulfilled, or does it hinder it? That's sort of the fundamental principle by which we judge whether consequences can be good or bad in the first place. So we sort of get back to this virtue ethics or this teleology as the principle, and consequences more of a side effect that can be good or bad.
Yeah, very interesting points again. I mean, because you are, of course, right. It isn't that easy to judge whether something has a good or bad consequence, and certain people with a different like hierarchy of values or a different preference in the moment will disagree about whether this consequence is now good or bad. And you can even say that everything has a good and a bad side, and so it might also depend more if you focus on the good versus the bad rather than about the actual thing in reality, even though I think there are states that are objectively better than others. So I wouldn't say that everything is equal, but you can always find a bad aspect even of something which is generally a good thing. So and so, as you said, we need some way of knowing whether something is now a good or bad consequence, and this would bring us back to certain principles about human nature. And so we would again end up by saying that you should live according to or trying to actualize your nature, and that then would be a good thing. And so it seems to be kind of linked. Whereas if you start to look at it like in a utilitarian kind of way, like trying to measure units of pain or pleasure or something like that, then it's very you just get into a big chaos and you can't really say anything very quickly. So that's interesting that you can't escape having some principle about human nature which you use to guide your actions if you want to be good or do good, and then I think you would say the consequences would be something like what Thomas Aquinas said, that when you do something which is good, then as a secondary consequence you have a good feeling. But the consequence is like a secondary thing that comes together with doing that which is metaphysically good, or in harmony with your nature or something like that.
Right, good points you brought up there, and one could also talk then about as a consequence of this approach, that actually by fulfilling one's nature, one would receive happiness, because happiness consists of this fulfillment and order in the soul, as I also argued in that earlier video conversation. And perhaps one analogy that would, I believe, illustrate this point about consequences and its relation to fulfillment of nature is, suppose that you have some bodily illness or disease, and you go to the doctor. Now, the purpose of that doctor, properly speaking, is to try to remove that illness or disease and restore the body to a healthy state. And what would that entail? What does it mean that the body will realize its healthy state? That is, it conforming to its essence, what the body is by nature meant to be, its natural condition. And that would, properly speaking, or strictly speaking, be the purpose of the doctor, to help the body restore its healthy state in conformity with nature, and remove that which hinder it from fulfilling this. And that is what we could view sickness, disease, illness. We could view that as certain conditions in which the body can be, which makes it deviate from its natural fulfilled state of being. And that doesn't, of course, mean that the doctor could not help the patient with avoiding certain pains and stuff like that, but that the primary purpose, that the principal purpose of the doctor is to restore the body to its healthy state, and not about trying to measure how much convenience or inconvenience or pleasure versus pain that the patient is feeling. He could care about that too, but that would be secondary to the primary purpose, which is about how can I help this person have his body fulfill its nature. So I think that would be a good analogy to the moral principle, that we're talking about what should individuals do, what should families do, and what should societies do. It's about how can we conform to what is good according to our nature and fulfilling, and reach that state. That should be the principle by which we judge what we should and should not do.
Yeah, I think interesting analogy that you made there. I've just talked about this yesterday with my sister, who is a doctor, and we talked about how the body always has to heal itself. For example, when you break an arm and the doctor puts like this thing around it, then it just keeps the bones straight so that they can grow together straight, but the bone has to grow together by itself. It's the body that does the healing. Or if you have a surgery and you remove either some object which you had through an accident get stuck into your body, or some cancerous cells or something, then the healing takes place by the body itself. And so it's really, as you said, that you have to help the body restore its own good condition. And what is the good condition? It's of course according to its nature. So for example, a bone should be able to bear a certain weight, and a muscle should be able to contract and to move something, etc., etc. And so I would have an interesting and a little bit an interesting follow-up question. So as we have started talking about lying versus speaking the truth, how do we know that the purpose of speaking is actually to speak the truth? And how do we know that it's not its natural purpose to deceive other people so that you can get something out of them? I'm being a little bit devil's advocate here, but I think it's an interesting question to explore.
Right, right. Yes, interesting points you brought up there. And to that follow-up question, yes. I'll see if I can sort of try to formulate a good response that dives into this issue in a good way. I would say that, well, here again we have an issue of, okay, the faculty of speaking. That is what speaking the truth, being honest versus lying, that is what it's about, the faculty of speaking and how we use that faculty. And we can, of course, talk about communication in a broader sense, like using your arms. That's another way you can communicate with people, but the faculty of speaking is one of the most common and elaborate forms. And then we have to investigate, well, what is the inherent nature or function of that faculty? And then I would say that what we discover when we think about it is that the faculty is about communicating truth. And this is what we see when we think about, well, what is it all about? The faculty of speaking, we could say that the faculty of speaking is about we having some conception of reality or some ideas, and then we're trying to convert those ideas into intelligible words, then arranged into terms, sentences, etc. And then we literally speak that out to the other, to the external world. And you could see that, well, it is about the speaking itself is always about reality. That's what it is about. You always speak out sentences about how things are, even if those sentences or those statements which you speak are not actually in conformity with reality, that you are either mistaken or even lying. Even in those cases, the speaking itself is about and supposed to talk about reality. And this is why we always presume, generally speaking, that when we hear someone talk and talk about certain things and claim certain things, we always recognize that, oh, in that act of speaking, he's making statements about how the world actually is. So it's always understood that in the nature of speaking, there is something about it that is about explaining or presenting information about reality. So even if the context of lying, we see immediately that it is distorting this, that it is you are using the faculty of speaking and saying something that is sort of in itself supposed to speak about reality. However, you are actually deceptive and you are abusing it. Because the speaking itself, you are making it seem as if it's fulfilling its purpose when it's actually not. So even the faculty of speaking, when it's used for lying, even here we see that you're still trying to exploit its natural purpose of spreading information, but now you're trying to distort it. Yes, I feel I could perhaps formulate the idea better, but that's at least some initial thoughts about it. So I hope that helped.
Yes, I think that's a good start. I think you could say it somewhat differently. There is this a little bit like a platitude, a little bit that some people say the lie cannot exist without the truth. But I think it goes into what you have been starting to dig up here, and that is the point. You can think if everybody were lying all the time with every sentence that they make, then the faculty of speaking would have no purpose at all. Because then I wouldn't listen to the words that someone else utters, because I know I can't really gain anything from it anyways. So if lying were the basic purpose of speaking, then speaking wouldn't even exist, because there would just be no use for it. And so you can only lie against a background of truth. So if many if most sentences that human beings speak to each other are actually trying to convey, as you have said, some fact of reality to another person, and really with that as the goal, then you can put into there one or two phrases which distort or abuse this mechanism by trying to make the other person believe something which actually in reality is not the case. But if people would lie all the time, then you just couldn't, the whole faculty wouldn't make sense and therefore wouldn't exist. And I had a second thought in this similar direction, which is we have often said human beings are social animals. So human beings derive a benefit from living in groups. And this benefit is far greater for them than perhaps the cost or the downside of living in groups. And that's why human beings live basically always in groups. And living in a group only makes sense if you are going to cooperate with the other members of this group to help each other. Because if you would only try to kill each other, then you wouldn't live with them together in a group, but you would live separately from them, like bears do, for example, because bears are not social animals. They live like alone as individuals in the wood. And so it seems that cooperation is kind of the basic mode of human interaction, at least within a society, and then abuse of this mode of interaction would be something like exploiting the other person without giving something back. And that's where also the lying comes in. But for cooperation, you need to speak the truth, of course, because you can't cooperate based on lying to each other.
Yes, very interesting points, and I would agree with those reflections there. And it could be said then, as a deeper metaphysical point, that similar to how evil is not a substance in itself, but rather a privation of good, we could say that lying is not something pure. Lying itself is not something that exists in itself, but rather is a distortion or privation of truth in a way. I think you have said that evil is sort of parasitic on the good. And I would perhaps say the same thing about lying. Lying is parasitic on the truth. So we see some metaphysical parallel here, and therefore the idea of pure lying and even pure falsehood without any distortion of something true is actually pure negation. It is nothingness. Similar to have pure, metaphysically speaking, pure evil without any distortion of anything good is nothing. It is non-existence, literally. And hence, it would be impossible then for us to have a faculty that is about producing falsehood and lies, because then we would have faculty of producing something that doesn't exist but a parasitic, something parasitic on something good and true. So it wouldn't make sense metaphysically. And also, yes, back to this commonly observed principle that every time we speak, in the act of speaking, we act as if it's about producing information about reality. Even people who lie, they try to make it that way. That sort of the point of lying is taking the natural purpose of the faculty, which is communicate truth, and using it against its natural purpose. So yes, that's why, and that's also secondarily why when people lie, they expect that the other person is assuming that you are using the faculty of speaking according to its natural purpose, when you are actually not doing it and you know it, which will be the case when a person is a liar. If you are a liar, then you would do it that way. So we see immediately that yes, it's a distortion of the natural faculty of speaking, which is speaking the truth. And therefore, if we go back to the approach of thinking of morality in terms of us fulfilling our purpose, and using our natural faculties in accordance with their end, we see therefore that when we abuse the faculty of speaking, that goes against us fulfilling our nature, and therefore we have grounds to say that this is immoral, just by that fact alone. But also, as you have pointed out, there are also secondary ways in which we could see that we are abusing our nature in a way. Because, as you say, human beings, living groups, generally speaking, we are social creatures, we form communities, and we communicate with others. Obviously, that is implied in the idea of social life, that you communicate with others and you cooperate with them. And that, of course, involves that you exchange information and help each other reach the truth. That is an important part of friendship and general cooperation in society. It's also, of course, a part of just economic transaction and information in that way, and other kinds of information. Truth and explaining things and presenting information is there all the time in social life. So if you produce lies, you contradict one of the most basic common goods of that society, which is to cooperate in the explanation of truth. Yes, and it will also destroy trust, which is an important foundation of that society as well. And we can, of course, get more into that if you want. But those are some thoughts about this subject that I think are very important.
Yeah, very, very good indeed. We could actually at some point have a separate conversation about trust and cooperation as being essential common goods of a society. I think that would be very interesting. And you are, of course, right that lying destroys this foundation or this common good just a little bit. So if enough people lie enough of the time, then a society will basically collapse because people no longer trust each other and no longer cooperate with each other. And so that's a very good point. I also liked your point that a pure lie, like metaphysically, cannot even exist, because every lie that you can think of has quite a substantial amount of truth in it. So I don't know, let's just take one example. Let's say I lie to a woman about certain aspects of myself, like my age or my wealth or something like that, so that I can get her into bed. Well, I still have to say plenty of things that are actually true, because else it would just be plain obvious that it's a lie. So it's always that you say mostly truth, but then you change one aspect of reality, and that is where the lie is. If you would just lie about everything, you couldn't probably even start a sentence with I did or am or anything, because as soon as you speak about yourself, you are referring to yourself, which actually truly exists in reality. And so you can't produce a statement which is 100% a lie. And so that's just an interesting little follow-up to that idea that lying is parasitic on the truth. And yeah, there is an interesting question here that I would want to pose to you, because I think we agree so far that the purpose of speaking in the context of a society is to convey the truth from one individual to another, and that lying is kind of an abuse of this faculty. And yeah, so the question is, for example, there is this famous Chinese strategician, I don't know if that's the right word, a military leader, Sun Tzu. And Sun Tzu wrote a book about the art of war. And one of his statements was, I'm not quoting it perfectly, but he said something like, in war you always have to lie. So if you are strong, you have to appear weak. And if you are weak, you have to appear strong. and if you are fast, you have to appear slow, and if you are slow, you have to appear fast, and so on. So you always have to uh, make the enemy believe something false about you so that you can win against him in war. And a similar idea, somewhat on an individual level, um, is this idea. There is this story in the Bible that when Abraham came down to Egypt, and let me see now, and I think the Pharaoh wanted to take his wife as a wife for himself. And Abraham was afraid that the Pharaoh would kill him in order to take his wife, and so he told everyone that his wife was his sister, which is basically a lie. And as a consequence of that, he was richly rewarded and came out of Egypt with much wealth and a bigger family and etc. And so again, the idea here is, and Peterson talks about this in his biblical series, that there are two domains of reality, if you want to call it so. There is order and then there is chaos. And when you are inside your own society and your society is functioning, then that's basically order. But when you are in a foreign society and you have to fear for your life, or when you are in war with another society, then that's basically chaos. And the idea might be that to tell the truth is the right thing to do when you are in order, but to deceive might be the right thing to do when you are in chaos. So, what do you think of that?
Well, I would say that because the approach to morality is about fulfilling our natural faculties, and that involves also using our faculty of speaking according to its natural end, which is communicating truth, it becomes a universal principle, that it is wrong to abuse it in order to lie, because it is impossible for a human being, for it to be justifiable, for him to use a faculty against its purpose, whether it's in a society with order or whether it is in a chaotic environment. It would be intrinsically wrong because it is an abuse of faculty and a faculty in itself. So hence, since something is intrinsically wrong, it becomes universally wrong, and not only wrong in certain contexts. So that would be the position in that regard. Now, yes, when it comes to what Abraham did concerning his wife, that would then be immoral for him to have done that. And that would sort of be an application of this principle of the wrongness of lying. Um, well, when it comes to this war scenario, now I don't know so much about those norms in war, so perhaps this is a subject that I have to think more about when it comes to war specifically, but perhaps something that one can keep in mind, and I'm not entirely sure whether this is truly applicable to that war context, but it might be, is that there is this possibility that perhaps you could do something that others can, in an accidental way, interpret as something which it is not. An example of this, which would be more obvious, I suppose, is that you know of a guy in your city that you live in, for instance, that for some strange, weird reason believes that if you paint your house red, that means that you work as a plumber, just to take something completely random. And he thinks that, and he goes around in the city and he looks, oh, there's a red house, that means that he lives, there is a plumber. Oh, there is a red house, then he is a plumber as well. Now let's suppose you live in your city and you know about this man, and he is eventually going to go to your neighborhood and look at your houses as well. But then you decide to paint your house red because you like the color red or something like that. Now you know that when that person is going by the house, he's going to conclude, oh, you are a plumber then. But no, you are not a plumber. Yes, you painted the house red, and that would be interpreted by that person to mean something that is false, and you would know about that in advance, but you go out and paint the house red anyway. But it's okay because he is sort of just he's interpreting it not you abusing the faculty of painting in itself, but he's just doing it in an accidental way, not in an essential way, to speak it more metaphysically. So hence that would not be understood as a kind of falsehood. So this would be more of an obvious hypothetical scenario of this principle, but perhaps there could be said something similar in certain war contexts, that some soldiers are behaving a certain way, that can be accidentally interpreted by others to mean things that is not true, but it's okay because you are not strictly speaking abusing a natural faculty against its end, because you're just painting or you're just behaving in a way that doesn't in itself intrinsically or essentially communicate something necessarily. That would be an abuse of your faculty and would only be perhaps falsely interpreted just in a non-essential way or an accidental way. So what do you think about this kind of idea?
Well, I could give you an example. So, for example, Sun Tzu would say that if you have only a small number of troops, but your enemy has a large number of troops, then at night you should light a lot of fires all over the place so that it looks as if you had many, many soldiers sitting around many, many fires. But that wouldn't be, I think, in your way, as you put it now, a direct lie, because you could say, well, I just light a lot of fires. That's just what I prefer to do. And if someone interprets this as meaning that there are a lot of people, well, then that's his own interpretation. So I guess in that sense you could restrict your own rule that lying is intrinsically and universally wrong. You could restrict it to speech alone, because you could say, well, hand gestures and facial expressions and acts in the world, they are always interpreted. They are not directly expressing a statement, so like a proposition. But I actually think that that's not a very helpful way of looking at it, because I think more, as you have said quite in the beginning, that it's about communication in general. So, for example, if I'm an actor and let's say I sell something to a person and I act as if this thing is really valuable and I'm really having a hard time to part with it, but then I eventually, yes, okay, I will sell it to you for this price, then this is actually also a form of misleading, even if you didn't explicitly say, I don't know, for example, this old car is still in very good shape, while you actually know that it's in bad shape. Even if you didn't say the words, if you act as if something were the case, then you also convey information to other people, because people don't only communicate by words, but by different means. And so I think it's perhaps even more about the act of not cheating, the act of misleading someone into believing something which you know is false.
Yes, it is a good point, and I might not have a completely exhaustive system of distinctions whereby we could judge whether something is within the realm of permissibility and not a direct lie, and whether something is outside a lie. Because I would say that if you do something that can only accidentally be interpreted as something that is not true, then that would not be a lie. But there are cases in which you can communicate something which is essentially, in the act itself, meant to be speaking something that is false. And I think there is a way we can properly apply this to distinguish between things, and thus concluding that in the case of painting your house red and the guy interpreting as a plumber, we wouldn't say that as a direct lie. But at the same time, we could still say that even statements that are not explicitly lying but very implicitly lying and very misleading, that could be understood as being a way of lying, because you are in a way communicating something that is supposed to be true, but you're doing it wrongly. And when, for instance, in the scenario you brought up, when you say this car is in good shape, well, it's true that good shape versus bad shape, that's relative. But still, if it is very obvious from the context that you intend to convey information about the car, which isn't true, that when you say this is in good shape, it's understood by everyone that, well, of course you mean that it is good shape according to this level, but it's not good according to this level, then it would be lying. So again, I might have to think more about how can we fully make the perfect distinctions and lines along which we distinguish different scenarios. But I think something along the lines of distinguishing between something that is essentially communicating falsehood and something that is not essentially communicating falsehood, but just accidentally interpreted as such. I think that would be a very useful and true guideline, even if we have to think about whether something is on that part of the line or this part of the line. So yeah, those are my thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think you made like a little lamp go off in my head. Um, I guess perhaps what you are searching for is the notion of intent, so that the intent of the person communicating is the important aspect. Because I happen to believe that morality has a lot to do, or perhaps very much to do, with the intent. So did this person behave in a certain way with the intent of making the other person believe something which is actually not true? Or did he just behave in this way as he himself felt to be good or right for certain reasons, and another person accidentally misinterpreted this and came to some impression of something being the case which is actually false? And so I guess you can communicate with good intent or just act with good intent, and still there will be misunderstanding. So in the case with your guy who for some weird reason thinks that red house means plumber, there will be a misunderstanding, but it's not an intentional misleading of the other person. Or perhaps when some people from two different cultures interact with each other, and these cultures have some different hand signals and to mean some different things. Like for example, in Europe, when we want someone to come, we do something like this, like come here. But in Japan, I think my father told me they do this, like come here. And so in Europe, this means actually go away, like I'm shoving you away. But in Japan, it means like I'm pulling you here. So this could be a source of misunderstanding, but there wouldn't be the intent of misleading someone.
Yes, that is an interesting point, and you could say that it's more about misunderstanding. Though perhaps some would say that, well, in the case of misunderstanding, then none of the participants would be aware that the other person is misunderstanding in the precise moment itself, but rather that they intend to speak truth, but just that something happened that made it not the case. But in the case of the plumber and the red house, the one painting wouldn't know that, oh, he is going to interpret my house as meaning that I am a plumber. But he's aware of it, but he's going to do it anyway because he's not doing anything wrong in the act of painting itself. But perhaps another interesting scenario too, which could be considered, is take the movement of the head. When you move the head like this, it usually means no. If you do this, and if you do this, it means yes. But I think there are some cultures, perhaps I'm wrong, but there might be some cultures where it is the opposite. That if you move the head like this, it means no, and this, it means yes. Perhaps I'm wrong, but yeah. Anyways, let's suppose for the sake of the argument that there are some cultures. Now, in those cultures, then of course there can be misunderstandings because you have different perceptions of what it means to move your head in this and that way. But suppose that we live in one culture, in our culture, where moving your head to this in this way means no, and in this way vertically means yes. Then if you abuse it in that context, that would be lying. If, for instance, someone asks you, well, did you go to the store today? And you go like this. Well, that would be, and you actually did go to the store and you know it, then that would be a lie. Even though the act of moving its head could be different in another culture, you still use it in the context of that understanding, and therefore would be lying. You could say the same thing about language, that yes, if when you lie in German, that would be a lie in German. But for an Englishman, he might not understand that German, but still, yeah. So perhaps that's another example. So yes, that might make that might entail, therefore, that there are distinctions and lines to be made between you using something to directly communicate something and you doing something that does not directly communicate something, but is simply accidentally, out of your control, interpreted by someone else in another way. A distinction that you could see, somewhat similar distinction in some more extreme acts of that are subject to moral discussion, the difference between killing and letting someone die. Because I think many people will agree that yes, the act of murdering someone is of course very evil and immoral, but sometimes it might be lawful to let someone die in order to save another life, for instance. And in the act of abortion, for instance, there is the idea that, well, there is something besides abortion where you do a procedure by which the fetus is not killed, but is dying, and you let it die. But that would not be the same as abortion because you're not intentionally or intrinsically killing that fetus. So just to take an example of how we can distinguish between you directly doing something that is wrong and you doing something that is not by itself wrong, but it's just accidentally interpreted that way. So, yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I think the point that it comes down to is people don't live in a vacuum, they live in a society. And in every society, there are kind of universally or yeah, there are known forms of communication, and these involve language, but they also involve, as you said, like the head movement, like this means yes, in every Western society, basically. And so, whereas painting your house red is not a universal sign that you are a plumber. And so, the question of whether you are lying or not has to do with, are you misusing a certain universally known form of communication of this society or not? Because the head movement, I mean, you could say, well, there is nothing immoral about me moving my head the way I want to move it. But that's not the point. The point is, when someone asks you a question and you move your head like this is a society-wide form of communication that everybody knows this has this meaning, and this is kind of a universal knowledge, and therefore it's a means of communication. Just as, yeah, and that's not the same for painting your house. And so I think that's the important distinction here.
Right, yes, I think that's a very relevant point, that is or are you using some kind of sign that is used in a context where within a context it can only mean one thing, and that is thus in that context becoming essential to the act of communication itself, or whether something is not adopting within itself some sign but is open to interpretation. So that's sort of the difference between doing something and the act itself is adopting some kind of sign, and cases where it does not adopt a sign, and that sign can be arbitrarily perhaps imposed by someone else, but that's outside of the act itself. So perhaps that would be a workable formulation. So yes, that would be my thoughts, I suppose, about the subject so far.
Yeah, I would want to take one point up again, and that is this question whether the whether it's okay, or you said that it's universally false to use the faculty of speaking to convey something which is false, and therefore you shouldn't lie no matter basically the state of your society that you are in. And I would want to go back to this idea of order and chaos, and because I think there are many movies in which the hero, or the person who eventually becomes the hero, in the beginning is kind of like a trickster. So he uh, is very good at deceiving people. Let's say, I don't know if you have seen this film. It's a rather new film. It's called King Arthur. And of course, the story is very old, but there was a new film made about it. And so there is basically some evil person has murdered their brother and become the king. And the son of the rightful king was kind of has escaped and is now growing up in the very lowest levels of society. Like some prostitutes basically took him in and take care of him so that he didn't die. And he then kind of maneuvers this basically corrupt society because it is ruled by an evil king. And at some point, he has to flee from the henchmen of the king, and then he meets some soldiers, some troops, and they ask him, "Where are you going this early in the morning?" And he just like on the spot he invents a lie, and he says, "Ah, I work on the docks, so I have to be up very early," or something like that. And there are many other examples of similar things, like in Disney movies or in other movies, where if society is corrupt, then the person who eventually becomes the hero is kind of really good at kind of slipping through the cracks and not getting caught by the henchmen of the corrupt society. And so Jordan Peterson talks about how the the faculty of admiration, the fact that we admire certain people, either in stories or in movies or in reality, is it has something to do with ethical behavior, that we admire people who are good in a fundamental sense. And so I just wanted to revisit this point because I really think that there is something that we admire these characters even though in this situation they lie. And I think, wow, that was kind of really clever. I don't think, wow, that was really evil. So yeah, what do you think of that?
Well, well, several things. First, yes, indeed, especially if you go back to the state of society before modernity, there was this ideal of heroes that would be moral and virtuous. Like, for instance, the Catholic saints would be very important role models. So, and I think this is one of the tragic thing today, that we have sort of replaced these morally virtuous heroes with a sort of pseudo heroes that seem cool and might be sort of superheroes, like these superhero movies, like Marvel movies, that aren't actually about them doing the good and being virtuous, but rather just doing cool things with technology. And that, I think, is bad, or certainly bad, I would say. Now, when it comes to heroes that would be considered to be morally virtuous, but then you see that they do something like lying, but you would interpret that as not something evil, but something as being justified or good or noble, even in some cases, some would perhaps say. Well, I would still say that that could Well, we have to go by the principles of morality that we have discovered through reason. That okay, if it is a principle that lying is wrong because it's abusing a faculty, then we just have to apply it. Even when it comes to people who might be considered to be morally virtuous heroes because they are generally doing a lot of good things. If they do some lie once, well, that we would then have to say, well, okay, him lying, that was not good. Now, when it comes to the gravity of lying, that of course might be, you could point out that, well, some lies are what is called white lies. They aren't very grave, they aren't very important or serious. So you could still say, well, those would be wrong, but it's not a grave matter. Uh, but on the other hand, lies that would be very grave, that would be gravely immoral. So there are degrees of gravity when it comes to immorality. But principally speaking, lying itself would be morally problematic or wrong, I would say. So yes, and it seems to me that honesty, after all, should be considered to be one of the virtues a morally virtuous hero should have. By the way, one also side note is that when someone is asking you, where are you going? There are ways you could answer by which you do not lie, but you do not necessarily tell the whole truth either. Um, so, for instance, you might leave certain things out that are central to why you go there and there, and you just restrain the amount of what you're saying. Um, there are cases where you could do that without that being lying, so that is also something I could point out.
Interesting. I think this is a point. Oh, there is a comment, but it's kind of really off topic. Does Christopher deny evolution? Um, First of all, sorry that we haven't seen the comment earlier, but I think we will ignore it for the moment because we are right in the middle of this very different discussion. Yeah, we have a video on evolution on our channel, so
Yeah, I could just say very briefly, yes, I do deny the theory of evolution, but yes, we could have a separate discussion of that, or check out the other videos, or yeah.
yeah, very good. Okay, I think this here is really a case where we differ, even though we have agreed on the first part mostly of this conversation, because I don't agree basically with all of the things that you have said, or most of them, in this response here. So, first of all, I don't really believe in the concept of white lies. I think that this is actually a very harmful concept. I think that if, let's say, if you are in order in a functioning society, then you should speak the truth, and that takes courage, and that leads to good things, and lying leads to bad things. And even though certain lies will not as quickly lead to as much of a bad thing, it's actually still, I think, you are harming yourself because you are making your own character worse, and you're harming the other person because you are depriving them of the truth, and you are basically, there is nothing good at it. So I don't believe that there is something like a white lie. And also, I don't believe that this thing which you have mentioned, that you can give an answer which is not technically a lie, but you just leave out certain parts of the truth that you don't express. I actually think that this is a very harmful idea as well. This goes, there is this idea that you are lying by omission, that if there is something very important and you are not saying that, then you are lying as well. Like one example that just came up yesterday, if you are researching a certain vaccination and you see that there were a couple of cases where people who got this vaccination developed a severe illness afterwards, but you just leave this out and say, well, basically all of these cases were good, and there were some special cases, but they don't really matter, or you don't just mention them at all, then that's a very big form of lying. And our media does this constantly by giving us like half truth and leaving out important aspects so that people will come to false conclusions. So I think that both of these are bad, are in my mind evil things to do. But on the third point is that I would kind of disagree that we have to stick with the principles that we have discovered by reason against our intuition. Like, I think the capacity to admire someone is kind of like a form of instinct which points us in the right direction. And I guess it's not a good idea to ignore our faculty of admiration by just referring to rationality, because rationality is not the only faculty that we have, and it might not even be the most important one. So I would disagree with that as well. Yeah.
Well, several points could be discussed there. First thing I would say is that yes, I would agree that even lies which would in many people's eyes be considered to be white lies, those would still be immoral. The point was rather that there are some lies that are less grave compared to others. So they would all be immoral, it's just that some would be more immoral than others. But yeah, all of them still wrong. Okay, and yes, some of the other points. Well, when it comes to leaving certain things out, I would certainly agree that there are many cases in which that would be completely immoral and indeed evil. Perhaps one then could say that in many of those cases the wrongness would be there because someone fails in his duty to speaking out and telling others a very important crucial truth. So that would be what is called the sin of omission, that you are omitting things you should not omit, that you have a duty to present truth. And that would, strictly speaking, I suppose, be something distinct from the duty of not lying. It's a distinct duty, which is more about what you should present to others. And that would be important truth. For instance, if you are a doctor and you have a patient, and the patient has a very serious, perhaps even deadly illness, and the patient doesn't know it, and you as a doctor discover it, well, the doctor has the duty to, I suppose, inform the patient about this so that the person is aware of it. And I think that's considered a duty. So you could say that, well, if the doctor does not tell the patient about this, then he's doing something wrong. It's not lying, strictly speaking, but it's another immoral act, and that is omission. Yes, and when it comes to cases where someone is talking about some medicine or drug which is really harmful, but doesn't tell people about the harmful cases, that would also be immoral, because that doctor is failing in his duty to tell people the crucial information about the safety or lack thereof of a certain drug. And that would be an instance of fraud, you could say, which would be immoral. And yes, and also you could have cases where a doctor explicitly or even implicitly says this medicine is very good and doesn't have any really serious side effects, then, and if it does have really serious side effects, that would be lying. Even though we can say, well, what is really serious and what is just less serious, that's relative. True, but you are saying it in a context, adopting a universal sign by which it is, of course, understood that you mean that it is safe enough so that you would avoid these and these and these kinds of cases. But if you do have these cases and you know it, you're lying, then you are committing an act of lying. Yes, the last point when it comes to admiration and rationality. Well, the thing is, we have to base our judgments or admiration, we have to base that upon reason. we have to admire that which is good and not admire that which is evil. And there might be cases where people admire something they should not admire, but then it is reason which tells us what we should admire and what we should not admire, because through reason we discover certain norms about what is good and bad. And therefore, admiration, which is fallible, should be based upon reason. So that is what I would say about that.
Interesting points. Just very briefly to the first two and then to the third one. It's an interesting question whether certain lies are more grave than others. I somehow feel inclined to agree, but somehow I also feel inclined to disagree. But perhaps that could be an interesting question for a separate discussion, because we are getting a little bit off track with it. And about this question whether not saying something which would kind of be your duty to say in this moment, whether that's a form of lying or a form of harming some other duty or ethical rule, it's in the end it's a question of definition. So we can't really it's just a question of definition. But I actually think that many of these cases, or all of these cases which we have discussed, it's all the common aspect is that some person is consciously misleading another person. Either when you lie, when you say something that you know to be false, or when you leave something away which you know to be important for the other person, you are also misleading them. And also when you make fake signals, like you act as if something was valuable when in fact you know that it's not valuable, or the other way around, like or when you make a lot of fires just with the conscious intention of misleading the other person. For me, these all together go into the category of lying, but I guess that's a question of definition, so there's no point in arguing about it extensively. But would you want to say something to that, or then we could go to the last one?
Yeah, I would say briefly that I think such a distinction about what is lying and what is strictly speaking not lying is important, because I would say that lying is saying something that is false and you know it to be false. And the wrongness of lying is grounded in the fact that you are abusing a faculty, namely the faculty of speaking or some other faculty of communication. And therefore, when you simply leave things out, that would therefore not be abusing a faculty, but simply not using a certain faculty, and that would not be the same as abusing something. And therefore there's a distinction there, and that's why when it comes to things about leaving things out, that could be in certain cases immoral for other reasons than lying. So that because of this metaphysical principle of fulfilling natures, not abusing faculties, there would be a relevant distinction in that regard. So.
Okay, so we disagree on the definition, that's okay. Yeah, so let's go to this last point with the admiration and the rationality. And I actually think this is a very complex question, and I don't have a fully developed view of it in mind, because you are right, you can admire certain people who do things which are in some sense immoral, but you kind of still admire them. And that's an interesting problem. And I don't really know how to solve it exactly, because I think human beings have more than one cognitive faculty. And or no, they have one like cognitive faculty, which is rationality, but they have many different instincts. Like for example, we have a conscience, and the conscience is not something that we produce by our rationality. It is some independent entity which exists and affects us, which we do not have under control with our rationality. And the same, I would say, goes for our faculty of admiration, and probably for a bunch of other very basic uh, biological systems that we have, like probably inherited from lower animal species. I would say, like, for example, the faculty of disgust, that you can be disgusted by something, which that's not a rational choice. It's some other form of judging reality as you see it. And so it's an interesting question. I guess you are saying that rationality should take precedence over all of these other faculties, but I'm not so sure about that. I think I'm not even sure if it's actually possible, but I guess I can't speak very well about it like Jordan Peterson, for example.
Well, I would sort of say that those other faculties, at least some of them, can be they can be misled in a way. For instance, the faculty of disgust, as you mentioned. There are some people who would consider something that is objectively morally good to be disgusting. Um, and yes, I am sure there are many people out there who, unfortunately, would consider things that both of us would agree are morally good and praiseworthy, would consider disgusting. Uh, and that would be a case in which someone would have their faculty in that case not being used properly, or in other words, being misled. Perhaps it's similar to emotions. People can have emotions that might not be in accordance with rationality. People might be angry of something they should not be angry of, and people might be sad of something they should not be sad of, etc., etc. And that there are probably many, many, many cases of this. So I would therefore think that these faculties, it should be a principle that, to the degree that they can be misled, that it should of course be preferred that they conform to what we know is true by reason. So if we have some emotion which we know is not really good according to our rationality, then we should wish for that emotion to be changed. Now, whether we can change emotions in that way, that, well, perhaps we can't, but at least we should wish for that, you could say, or we should think that, well, it's good for other faculties to be in accordance with rationality. Um, yeah. So, yeah. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, as I said, this is something I haven't, I have no definitive, like, finished position on it, but I think it's an interesting question. And one thought that really came to my mind is that it's true what you say, but the problem is that the faculty of rationality can, of course, also be misled. And this has happened to many people at many times, um, that they have been misled either by false arguments that came from the outside or just by false conclusions that they draw by themselves. And so the faculty of rationality can also go kind of wander off in its own domain and just keep going further and further along a certain path and actually come away from that which is true or good by getting confused by itself. And in some sense, the biological emotions can also be a certain anchor that holds you to the ground and to your nature, which is fundamentally biologically kind of determined. So, for example, the fact that you admire something is itself an important piece of information, which can also help you to figure out or to realize that your rationality has actually gone off the rails. So I'm not sure how to solve that, but I think that's a thought that I had.
First, a side note. Unfortunately, I have to go in not that many minutes from now to do some stuff. So we'll have to end the live stream a little bit earlier than previously, but I hope that's okay. Right. Okay, so one thing I would say about, yes, it is certainly true that people do not can err in their reasoning. They can adopt logical fallacies, etc. But the thing is also that with our faculty of rationality, we can correct such failures of reasoning and change our worldview to the better by using our faculty of reason to come closer to the truth and correct earlier mistakes. So we have this gift really of reasoning and rationality to correct a false understanding of the world. And yes, rationality is fundamentally about considering the logical structure and relations of things from reality. So it's always about, it's inherently directed toward realizing truth about the world, and we do not see this present in the other faculties, I would say. Yes, and when it comes to things like emotions, disgust, etc., they do not actually tell us, could say, about, because they're not telling us about reality, but they are reacting to reality. And perhaps you could say that, well, emotions, a specific emotion or a specific reaction could imply that there is something out there that triggered that. But I would say when we talk about how to gain knowledge of reality, properly speaking, we are receiving information through five senses, and then we're using our faculty of rationality to make that sense information intelligible and understand things properly. So that's why I would say it's important to have other things in hierarchy, in hierarchical relation to that. Yeah, so perhaps that would be my thoughts on that matter.
Yeah, interesting. I think, yeah, perhaps we can not, we will not be able to follow it to the end, also because we don't have time, and also because I haven't really, I still have some open questions there, but I just think it's interesting, and this might also be interesting. Jordan Peterson has mentioned many times that there is this idea in Catholicism that rationality cannot be the highest entity. That there is, for example, this poem by Milton called Paradise Lost, which I think was quite influential in developing this idea that Satan is somehow associated with the arrogant intellect, with the rationality that puts itself at the highest position in the value hierarchy. And so, yeah, I don't know how to solve this, but just to say, like, for example, you are right that rationality has to do with logical comparison, and that it can correct errors of itself by thinking about them. But when you start on false axioms, for example, let's say through some character flaw or some evil motive, you have chosen an evil axiom as the starting point of your reasoning, then your rationality cannot correct this problem, because based on the axiom, the reasoning is actually correct. It's just that the axiom is false in a different sense, because it's kind of immoral, or yeah, it's somehow guided by some evil motive. And so, yeah, I can't formulate it any better for the moment, but I just think that it's an open and interesting problem.
Well, this is a deep idea or topic, and would be sort of a big discussion itself. But I would say that, well, multiple things to be said. When it comes to what the Catholic religion teaches, well, there is of course something higher than reason, and that would be faith. So faith would be knowledge of truth which are above reason, which cannot be attained through reason alone, but is revealed by God and accepted by faith. And those, of course, faith and reason would be in harmony with each other because they both refer to the same reality. Now, you could say that the rationality, the thing about rationality is, again, it tells us about how the world operates when used properly. So when it comes to the idea of axioms, I would say that, well, perhaps it depends on how one defines an axiom. I would say there are certain fundamental principles, what can be called first principles about reality, that cannot, properly speaking, be proven by other facts, but are true by virtue of their own nature. Such as that every existing thing has an identity, or the law of non-contradiction, or the fact that every material thing has a dimension in time, space, etc. Those are metaphysical necessary truths. And some of these truths are so deep that they cannot be proven by some even deeper principle, but the proof is sort of contained within the principle itself. And the law of causality would be another one. And I wouldn't say that this is therefore an axiom which could be challenged and not followed. I would say that those principles are infallibly true because they are self-proven in the way that the law of non-contradiction must be true infallibly. It's not something. It's not simply some principle you adopt for some practical reason, but it's something that must be true by virtue of itself. And when you reason, when you use the reason based upon these principles, you will receive certain knowledge about how reality works. Of course, we know that human beings can err and they can follow logical fallacies, but at least we have the potential and the ability within ourselves to reach a certain knowledge about things. So, yes, I wouldn't consider sort of all worldviews as based upon axioms that are fallible in that way. I'm not saying that that is what you believe, but I would say that it's important to think about how reasoning can actually give us certain knowledge. Perhaps this idea of axioms is something we could elaborate more on in a separate discussion as well.
I guess that would be a good idea because that's a very deep issue and one that I'm very interested in, but we will not do it in a couple of minutes. Actually, Emil has just dropped in and said hi, which is unfortunate because we are almost thinking of ending right now. So, yeah, I don't also know what exactly to add to the kind of conversation we had so far. Do you wish to make like a summary or a last statement, or should we just, what should we do?
Well, I'm not quite sure. Perhaps just one very brief side note to the idea of the devil and pride. Well, that Lucifer fell from heaven due to pride is an ancient Christian doctrine. Saint Augustine talked about the devils falling from heaven due to pride, and I can find some Bible passages talking about that as well, but perhaps that will be a different discussion. But just as a quick note on that issue. Right. So I suppose we could make closing statements, but perhaps Emil here, if you, Emil, perhaps if you had a question that you wanted to ask us, I suppose we could answer that question before we wrap things up. What do you think about that, Amos?
Yeah, kind of like a small last part of the live stream today.
Yes.
So, yes, we were talking about lying before, but it will take 10 seconds before Emil hears our what we have said right now, so that's why we have to wait a little bit.
I see that we had 5 people watching, then 4 people, then 3. Okay, so it has been reduced a little bit, but a bit unfortunate that we came in the latter part.
Yeah, but we should perhaps announce it, but I think for the start, when not many people are watching, it's good to get some practice, and then at some point we should kind of have some specific time that people know it will start at that point, but right now there are not many people that want to view it regularly, so we're getting warmed up, I guess.
Yeah, perhaps it would be more people if we had it later in the day, that people are not ready to have it at 11 o'clock or 10 o'clock. But I'm not sure. What do you think?
It might be, on the other hand side, it might also be that many people would go outside and do something in the afternoon. So we might say to have it in the evening, but that might be also for some people they would want to go out in the evening, so I don't know. Yeah, if someone has some preferences, then they can write it in the comments.
Yes, yeah, I see your point. I agree. So there isn't necessarily a perfect solution. So yeah, but oh well.
Yeah, it seems that Emil didn't have a spontaneous question that he wanted to ask. So, yeah, I don't know. Perhaps it would be good. We have done 1.5 hours, which is also long enough. 11 is a good time for Emil. That's good to hear.
Yeah, yes. Now it came on here for me too. There's 2 seconds delay. But yeah. Okay. Interesting. Right. Okay. Should we go to closing statements, perhaps?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, I can begin. Right, so today we have discussed many very interesting points. Many of those were covered in the general subject of lying. Is it wrong to lie? And if so, when is it wrong? When is it permissible? Is it always wrong to lie? And I have argued that it is universally wrong to lie. It is immoral because we are then abusing a faculty of ours, namely the faculty of communication, more specifically, in many cases, the faculty of speaking, which has the natural purpose of communicating truth. But then we are abusing it against its natural end, and therefore we are contradicting what morality is about, which is to fulfill our human nature. It's not strictly speaking about consequences in the world that we produce, but rather how are we going to fulfill our nature and act in accordance with our inherent natural ends or functions. And therefore lying would be immoral. And we have discussed several things about, okay, what about certain kind of signs that people give? Can that be, are those necessarily lying? Or could those be cases of you just doing things and others interpreting them accidentally? And we've discussed different lines and distinctions in that regard. So yes, very interesting discussion. We also discussed some deeper issues about the approach to morality itself. How should we approach morality? Society, our social nature, and some metaphysical issues about the nature of falsehood and lies versus truth, and also axioms even and first principles at the latter part there. So it has been productive, interesting, many points covered, and I would then say that it also was enjoyable. Thank you, Amos, for having me on, or both of us participating on this live stream. It was very interesting, and I hope for those who have watched that they enjoyed the part that they watched as well. And I would then end by wishing you, Amos, and the audience a good weekend.
Great, yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I think the conversation was very productive and interesting, and I guess it might also be interesting to people who watched it or who will watch it afterwards. We had a little in the beginning. We were mostly agreeing on. Thanks, Emil. You have a good weekend too. Yes, we were mostly agreeing like on the function of speech and how human beings are social animals, and that cooperation is a fundamental purpose of living together in groups, and therefore speaking the truth is fundamental, and also that you can't even lie without using the truth in a parasitical way. So these were very interesting points. I think for me, the definition of lying is more consciously misleading another person, whereas for Christopher, the definition is more speaking words that are not in accord with reality. So we have a slightly different definition. And in the second part, then we had a little a disagreement about whether it's always wrong to lie or whether there are some like fundamentally different circumstances. I called them order and chaos based on Jordan Peterson, where lying might be false in order but good in chaos. So we haven't agreed on that point. And also the question of can admiration inform our rationality, or is rationality above the faculty of admiration? We haven't basically agreed on that point as well. But it was an interesting conversation, many aspects brought together. So yeah, I think it was great, and I'm looking forward to the next weekend. So I wish you and the audience a great weekend, and I hope to see you all in a week.
Just very, very briefly as well, yeah, I would define lying somewhat more broader than simply speaking. It could be writing and also other signs, but just as a very brief clarification. I also see that Emil here has written, he wrote two questions. What do you think of Thomism and what do you think of truth? So just so that you know that, perhaps this is something we could discuss at a later occasion, especially when it comes to what is truth. That is also very deep, and also Thomism. If you don't know, that's the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. So, yeah. But, yeah, that was just some brief points I had.
Great. Then goodbye, everyone, and hopefully see you next week.